What if I told you that a young couple vanished from the face of the earth, and for over 40 years, no one knew what happened to them? What if I told you they left behind a baby girl, a child who would grow up never knowing her real name, never knowing her parents were murdered, never knowing that the people who raised her were connected to one of the most terrifying cults in American history? And what if I told you that when investigators finally cracked this case wide open, it was already too late? Every single suspect was dead. Every person who could have faced a jury, who could have been handcuffed, who could have heard a judge pronounce sentence, had already escaped into the grave. No arrests, no trials, no convictions, no justice, at least not the kind that comes with prison cells and orange jumpsuits. This is the true story of Dean and Tina Clouse, a young couple who disappeared in 1978, a baby girl who was stolen and raised by killers, a grandmother who searched for decades and died without answers, and a cold case that was finally solved 43 years too late to put anyone behind bars. I promise you, by the end of this, you will never forget their names. Before you go any further, I need you to do something. If you believe that stories like this deserve to be told, if you believe that victims deserve to have their names remembered even when the justice system fails them, then hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because Dean and Tina's story almost died with them. The only reason we know the truth today is because a few stubborn people refused to let them be forgotten. Do not let their story disappear again. Let me take you back to 1978. Houston, Texas. The air is thick with humidity, and a young couple is trying to build a life together. Dean Clouse is 23 years old. He has dark hair, a quiet confidence, and the kind of steady presence that makes people trust him. He works hard at a local restaurant, dreams of something bigger, and loves his wife with everything he has. Tina Clouse is 21. She has gentle eyes, a warm smile, and a heart that sees the best in everyone. Maybe that was her greatest gift. Maybe, in the end, that was what got her killed. Together, they have a daughter. Her name is Holly. She is not even 2 years old yet, with tiny fingers that wrap around her father's thumb and a laugh that fills their small apartment with joy. They do not have much money. They are not famous or important by the world's standards. They are just a young family trying to make it, trying to build something good in a world that does not always make it easy. Dean goes to work. Tina stays home with Holly. They talk about the future, about saving enough money to move somewhere with a backyard, somewhere their daughter can run and play. They make plans the way young couples do, full of hope and completely unaware that their time is running out. In the fall of 1978, something changes. Dean and Tina tell their families they are leaving Houston. They have met some people, they explain. Good people. A group that is offering them work, community, a fresh start. The details are vague, but Dean and Tina seem excited. They seem hopeful. Their families wish them well, embrace them one last time, and watch them drive away with baby Holly in the back seat. That was the last time anyone in their family ever saw them alive. At first, no one panics. Dean and Tina are young. Young people are spontaneous. Young people lose touch for a while and then resurface with stories to tell. But days turn into weeks. Weeks turn into months. The phone calls that were promised never come. The letters that were expected never arrive. The silence grows louder and louder until it becomes deafening. Dean's mother, Donna Clouse, begins to worry. She makes phone calls to everyone she can think of. She writes letters. She contacts the police. She files a missing persons report. But in 1978, missing persons cases are not handled the way they are today. There are no Amber Alerts. There are no viral social media posts. There are no DNA databases or forensic genealogy websites. There is just a mother, sitting by her phone, staring at the door, waiting for her son to walk through it. He never does. The years begin to pass. 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, a decade. Donna never stops searching. She never stops believing that somewhere out there, Dean is alive. That somewhere out there, her granddaughter Holly is growing up. She keeps Dean's photograph on her mantle. She keeps his room ready, just in case. She keeps hope alive even as everyone around her begins to lose theirs. What Donna does not know, what she will never know, is that her son and daughter-in-law are already dead. They were killed not long after they drove away from Houston. Their bodies were dumped in a wooded area near Austin, Texas, and their baby daughter Holly was taken by the same people who murdered her parents. Dean and Tina Clouse did not just disappear. They were erased, murdered, and discarded like they never existed. And the people who did it got away with it completely. They lived out their entire lives without ever being questioned, without ever being arrested, without ever spending a single day in a jail cell. By the time investigators finally solved this case in 2021, every single suspect was already dead. This is a story about what happens when evil escapes justice. But it is also a story about what survives when justice fails. Truth survives. Love survives. Family survives. Stay with me, because the next chapter is where the nightmare truly begins. To understand what happened to Dean and Tina Clouse, you need to understand the world they walked into. A world of manipulation, control, and violence. A world connected to one of the most infamous names in American criminal history, Charles Manson. By 1978, Charles Manson had been in prison for years. The murders of Sharon Tate and the LaBiancas had shocked the nation. The Manson family had become synonymous with evil, with the dark side of the 1960s counterculture, with everything terrifying about charismatic leaders and vulnerable followers. But here is what most people do not realize. The Manson family did not end when Charles Manson went to prison. His followers did not simply disappear. Some of them remained loyal to his ideology. Some of them continued living according to his twisted teachings. Some of them scattered across the country, avoiding the spotlight, staying out of trouble just enough to avoid arrest, but never truly leaving the darkness behind. And some of them were still recruiting, still looking for vulnerable young people, still hunting for new victims. Dean and Tina Clouse walked right into their trap. We do not know exactly how Dean and Tina first encountered this group. The details have been lost to time, buried with the people who could have told the full story. Maybe it happened through Dean's work at the restaurant. Maybe it happened through a chance meeting, a friendly conversation, an invitation that seemed innocent enough. Cults do not announce themselves. They do not wear signs that say danger. They come disguised as community, as friendship, as opportunity. What we do know is that by the fall of 1978, Dean and Tina had become involved with people who had direct ties to the Manson family. These were not the famous names, not the ones who made headlines and went to prison. These were the ones who slipped through the cracks, the ones who were never caught, the ones who continued Manson's work in the shadows. They were charming. They were persuasive. They knew exactly what to say to a young couple struggling to make ends meet, looking for meaning, looking for belonging, looking for something more than the daily grind of survival. They promised community. They promised purpose. They promised a new way of living, free from the corruption and materialism of mainstream society. To Dean and Tina, exhausted from working hard and getting nowhere, caring for a baby with limited resources, it must have sounded like a dream come true. It was not a dream. It was a death sentence. We need to pause here and acknowledge something important. Dean and Tina were not stupid. They were not reckless. They were not asking for trouble. They were young, hopeful, and trusting in a way that should be celebrated, not punished. They believed in the goodness of people. They believed that kindness offered should be accepted with gratitude. They had no way of knowing that the kindness being offered to them was a lie designed to lure them to their deaths. This is how cults work. They prey on good people. They exploit trust. They take advantage of hope. And by the time the victim realizes what is happening, it is already too late. Dean and Tina made their decision. They packed up their belongings, put baby Holly in the car, and drove away from Houston. They believed they were driving toward a better life. They were driving toward their graves. The group took them in. For a while, things probably seemed fine, maybe even good. Cults are expert at creating an initial sense of belonging, of warmth, of family. The manipulation comes later, after the victim is already invested, already isolated from their real family, already dependent on the group for everything. We do not know exactly when things went wrong. We do not know what triggered the violence. Maybe Dean started asking questions. Maybe Tina wanted to leave. Maybe they saw something they were not supposed to see, learned something they were not supposed to know. Or maybe they were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, expendable pawns in someone else's twisted game. What we know is this. Dean Clouse was killed. Tina Clouse was killed. Their bodies were transported to a remote wooded area near Austin, Texas, and dumped there like garbage. Like they were nothing. Like they had never mattered at all. But Holly was not killed. The cult members looked at this baby girl, this tiny witness to their crimes, and made a decision. They would not murder her. They would keep her. They would raise her as their own. They would give her a new name, a new identity, a new history. They would erase Dean and Tina Clouse so completely that their own daughter would never know they existed. And that is exactly what they did. For more than 40 years, Holly lived with a stolen identity. She grew up calling killers her family. She celebrated holidays with people who had murdered her parents. She trusted people who had built her entire life on a foundation of blood and lies. And the people who did this were never arrested, never charged, never brought to justice. They lived free. They died free. They took their secrets to the grave. Every single suspect in the murders of Dean and Tina Clouse was dead before investigators solved the case. This is not a story with a satisfying ending. This is not a story where the bad guys get what they deserve. This is a story about how evil sometimes wins, at least in the legal sense. But it is also a story about how truth can still emerge, even decades later. How family can still find each other, even across impossible distances. How love can survive, even when justice fails. Stay with me. The story is about to get even more painful before it gets better. 3 years after Dean and Tina disappeared, their bodies were finally discovered. But by then, it was already too late for identification. Too late for answers. Too late for justice. It was 1981. Hikers in a wooded area near Austin, Texas, stumbled upon human remains. They were horrified. They called the police. Investigators arrived and began processing the scene. What they found were 2 bodies, a man and a woman, young. Their remains were badly decomposed, damaged by time and exposure to the elements. There was no identification on them, no wallets, no purses, no documents that could tell investigators who these people were. The investigators did what they could with the technology available in 1981. They documented the scene. They collected evidence. They searched missing persons databases for potential matches. But without DNA technology, without facial reconstruction software, without the forensic genealogy tools that would be developed decades later, they hit a dead end. The man and woman were classified as John and Jane Doe. Their files were placed in storage. Their case went cold. And Dean and Tina Clouse, who had names and families and people who loved them, became anonymous victims. Just 2 more bodies in a system that produces too many to count. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Donna Clouse was still searching. She had reported her son missing. She had contacted every law enforcement agency she could find. She had followed every lead, no matter how faint or unlikely. But she never thought to check the unidentified remains found near Austin. Why would she? Her son had left Houston heading toward opportunities, not toward a shallow grave in the Texas wilderness. The disconnect was tragic. Dean and Tina's bodies existed in a database. Their family was desperately searching for them. But the 2 sides never connected. The technology that could have linked them did not yet exist. The lucky break that could have solved the case never came. So the years passed, and passed, and passed. Donna Clouse grew older, but she never stopped looking. She kept her son's photograph on her mantle. She kept his memory alive at every family gathering. She talked about Dean to anyone who would listen, hoping that maybe someone had seen him, heard from him, knew something that could bring him home. She wrote letters. She made phone calls. She hired private investigators when she could afford them. She did everything a mother could possibly do to find her missing child. And she did all of it for nothing. Because Dean was already dead. He had been dead since 1978. His body was lying in a morgue somewhere, labeled with a number instead of a name, waiting for someone to claim him. No one ever did. Not while Donna was alive. Donna Clouse died in 2011. She was in her 80s. She had spent more than 30 years searching for her son, her daughter-in-law, her granddaughter. She had spent more than 30 years hoping, praying, refusing to give up. And she died without ever knowing what happened to any of them. Let me pause here and let that sink in. A mother spent 3 decades searching for her child. She never found him. She never got answers. She never got closure. She died with a broken heart that never healed, haunted by questions that would not be answered until years after she was gone. This is what cold cases do to families. They do not just rob victims of their lives. They rob survivors of peace. They stretch grief across decades, turning mourning into an endless nightmare that never ends because there is never an ending. Donna Clouse deserved to know what happened to her son. She deserved to hold her granddaughter. She deserved to bury Dean properly and say goodbye. She got none of that. But her daughters, Dean's sisters, were still alive, and they had inherited their mother's determination. They continued the search after Donna died, keeping the case alive, keeping Dean's memory burning, refusing to let their brother fade into forgotten history. They would eventually get the answers their mother never received. But those answers would come with a bitter truth. The people who killed Dean and Tina, the people who could have faced justice, were already dead. Every single suspect had escaped into the grave before they could be arrested, charged, or brought to trial. The killers won. They lived their entire lives as free people. They never spent a day in prison. They never faced a jury. They never heard a judge pronounce their crimes to the world. But the truth was coming. Slowly, painfully, decades too late, but coming nonetheless. For 40 years, the case of Dean and Tina Clouse went nowhere. 2 unidentified bodies in Texas. A missing persons report in Houston. A family searching desperately for answers. None of it connected. None of it led anywhere. Then came forensic genealogy. This technology, developed in the 2010s and refined over the following years, revolutionized cold case investigations. By extracting DNA from remains and uploading the genetic profiles to public databases, investigators could now find relatives of unidentified victims. They could trace family trees. They could put names on bodies that had been anonymous for decades. In 2021, a team of investigators working with the Texas Attorney General's office decided to apply this technology to old cold cases. They pulled the files on the John and Jane Doe found near Austin in 1981. They extracted DNA from the remains. They uploaded the profiles to genealogy databases. And they found a match. The DNA connected to the Clouse family. After 40 years of nothing, the investigation suddenly had a breakthrough. The John and Jane Doe were not anonymous victims anymore. They were Dean and Tina Clouse from Houston, Texas, the young couple who had disappeared in 1978, the parents of a baby girl named Holly. The news hit the Clouse family like a thunderbolt. Dean's sisters, who had continued their mother's search for all those years, finally had an answer. Their brother was dead. He had been dead since 1978. He had been lying in a morgue, unidentified, for 4 decades. The confirmation was devastating. As long as Dean remained missing, there was always a sliver of hope, however irrational, that maybe he was still out there somewhere. That maybe he would come home someday. That maybe there was a happy ending waiting. Now that hope was gone. Dean was dead. Tina was dead. They had been murdered and dumped in the woods like their lives meant nothing. But the investigation was not over, because there was still one member of the Clouse family unaccounted for. Holly. Dean and Tina had a baby daughter when they disappeared. She was not yet 2 years old. She had never been found. Her body had never been recovered. There was no record of her death. Was it possible that Holly was still alive? Investigators began searching. They used the same forensic genealogy techniques that had identified Dean and Tina. They looked for anyone who might be genetically related to the Clouse family, anyone who might be the missing daughter. What they found was almost impossible to believe. Holly was alive. She was living in the United States. She was now a grown woman in her mid-40s. She had a family of her own. She had survived. But there was a devastating complication. The woman investigators identified as Holly Clouse had no idea who she really was. She had a different name, a different history, a completely fabricated identity. She had spent her entire life believing a lie, never knowing that her real parents had been murdered, never knowing that she had been stolen as a baby by the same people who killed them. The people who raised her had given her a new identity. They had erased every trace of Dean and Tina Clouse from her life. They had raised her as their own child, knowing the entire time what they had done to her real parents. And here is where the story reaches its most frustrating point. By the time investigators identified these people, by the time they connected the dots and understood what had happened, every single suspect was already dead. The couple who had raised Holly had both passed away before the case was solved. Other members of the group connected to the Manson family had died over the years. Some from natural causes, some from illness, some under circumstances that were never fully explained. There was no one left to arrest, no one left to question, no one left to put on trial. The people who murdered Dean and Tina Clouse, who stole their daughter, who constructed an elaborate lie that lasted more than 4 decades, had all escaped justice. They lived out their natural lives. They died as free people. They were never handcuffed, never photographed for a mugshot, never forced to stand before a judge and answer for their crimes. This is the reality of this case. Despite the breakthrough in forensic genealogy, despite the identification of the victims, despite finding Holly alive, no one was ever arrested. No one was ever charged. No one was ever prosecuted. The legal system completely failed Dean and Tina Clouse. But the story does not end there. Because even without arrests, even without trials, even without convictions, something important was about to happen. Holly was about to learn the truth. And she was about to meet her real family for the first time. Imagine getting a phone call that destroys everything you thought you knew about yourself. Imagine being told that your name is not your name, that your parents are not your parents, that your entire identity is a fabrication built on murder and kidnapping. This is exactly what happened to Holly Clouse. When investigators reached out to the woman they had identified as Holly, they faced an impossible task. They had to tell her that her biological parents had been murdered in 1978, that she had been stolen as a baby, that the people who raised her, the people she had loved and trusted her entire life, were connected to one of the most infamous cults in American history. How do you even begin that conversation? How do you shatter someone's entire reality and then ask them to pick up the pieces? Holly agreed to take a DNA test. Part of her probably hoped the investigators were wrong. Part of her probably prayed that this was all some terrible mistake, that her life was exactly what she had always believed it to be. The DNA results destroyed that hope. They confirmed what investigators already suspected. She was the biological daughter of Dean and Tina Clouse. She was the missing baby who had vanished 45 years earlier. She was not who she thought she was. I want to pause here and ask you something. If you discovered tomorrow that everything you believed about your identity was a lie, how would you react? How would you begin to rebuild your sense of self? How would you reconcile your love for the people who raised you with the knowledge of what they had done? Leave your answer in the comments below. I genuinely want to know what you think. Because Holly had to face all of these impossible questions with no roadmap, no guidance, no one who had ever been through exactly what she was experiencing. The psychological weight of this revelation is almost impossible to comprehend. Holly had to process the fact that her real parents were murdered. She had to accept that she was stolen as a baby. She had to grapple with the reality that the people who raised her, the people she had called mom and dad, had built her entire life on a foundation of blood and lies. Every memory was now contaminated. Every birthday celebration, every holiday gathering, every moment of love and connection she had experienced with her adopted family was now shadowed by the knowledge of what they had done, what they had known, what they had hidden. And she could not even confront them, because they were already dead. This is perhaps the cruelest part of the entire story. Holly never got the chance to ask the people who raised her why. She never got to look them in the eyes and demand answers. She never got to hear them explain or justify or apologize for what they had done. They took their secrets to the grave. They escaped not just legal justice, but personal accountability as well. Holly was left with nothing but questions that would never be answered. Why did they kill my parents? Why did they take me? Did they ever feel guilt? Did they ever consider telling me the truth? Did they love me? Or was I just a trophy, a possession, a reminder of their crime? These questions will haunt Holly for the rest of her life. And there is no one left alive who can answer them. But Holly was not completely alone. Because while she had lost the family she thought she knew, she was about to discover the family that had been searching for her for over 40 years. Dean's sisters were still alive. Holly's biological aunts. Women who had grown up with her father, who had mourned him for decades, who had continued their mother's search long after Donna died. They had been waiting for this moment without even knowing if it would ever come. When they learned that their niece had been found, the emotions were overwhelming. Joy and grief tangled together in ways that could not be separated. Joy because Holly was alive. Grief because Dean and Tina were confirmed dead. Joy because the search was finally over. Grief because Donna had not lived to see this day. A reunion was being arranged. After 45 years of separation, Holly Clouse was about to meet her real family. But first, she had to make a choice. She had to decide whether to step into this new identity, to embrace these strangers who shared her blood, to build a relationship with people she had never known existed. It was not an easy choice. Nothing about this situation was easy, but Holly made her decision. She chose to meet them. She chose to learn about her real parents. She chose to reclaim the identity that had been stolen from her before she was old enough to remember. She chose family, even though that family came with pain, even though that family came with grief, even though that family could never replace what she had lost or answer the questions that would forever remain unanswered. Holly Clouse chose to move forward. And that choice, made in the midst of unimaginable trauma, is one of the bravest things I have ever heard of. The day Holly Clouse met her biological family for the first time was thick with emotions that words cannot adequately capture. 45 years of separation. 45 years of not knowing. 45 years of grief and hope and searching, all culminating in a single moment when strangers became family. Dean's sisters traveled to meet their niece. They brought photographs of Dean and Tina, images Holly had never seen, faces she had never known. They brought stories and memories, fragments of a history that had been deliberately erased from her life. They brought decades of accumulated tears, finally ready to fall. And when they saw Holly for the first time, they saw their brother looking back at them. Holly had Dean's features. She had Tina's eyes. She was living proof that her parents had existed, that they had loved each other, that they had created something beautiful before they were taken from this world. In her face, the sisters could see echoes of the brother they had lost, the sister-in-law they had mourned, the family that had been shattered by violence so many years ago. The embrace that followed was more than a hug. It was a bridge across decades. It was a defiance of the evil that had tried to erase the Clouse family from history. It was proof that some bonds cannot be broken, no matter how hard someone tries to sever them. Holly learned about her parents for the first time. She heard stories about Dean's laugh, his work ethic, his dreams for the future. She learned about Tina's warmth, her devotion to her baby daughter, her gentle spirit. She saw photographs and imagined moments she should have experienced but never did. This knowledge was both a gift and a wound. A gift because it gave Holly roots, a history, an identity that was truly hers. A wound because it showed her exactly what had been stolen, exactly what she would never have, exactly what should have been but was not. She should have grown up with Dean teaching her to ride a bike. She should have had Tina braiding her hair and reading her bedtime stories. She should have known her grandmother Donna, the woman who searched for her until her dying breath. She should have had birthday parties and holiday dinners and ordinary Tuesday evenings with her real family. Instead, she got lies. She got strangers raising her under a false name. She got a childhood built on the graves of her murdered parents. But here is where Holly showed extraordinary strength. She did not let the bitterness consume her. She did not collapse under the weight of what had been done to her. She chose, deliberately and courageously, to focus on what she had gained rather than what she had lost. She had aunts now, real aunts who shared her blood and loved her immediately. She had cousins she had never known existed. She had a connection to her father and mother that, while it could never replace their physical presence, was real and meaningful and hers. She also had something else. She had the truth. For 45 years, Holly had lived a lie. She had not known who she was, where she came from, or what had happened to her real parents. Now she knew. The truth was painful, yes, but it was also liberating. It freed her from the false identity that had been imposed on her. It allowed her to finally, truly, know herself. Holly's children now know their real grandparents. They have seen photographs of Dean and Tina. They have heard stories about who they were and how much they love their baby daughter. They understand that their family history is complicated and painful and ultimately triumphant. They carry Dean and Tina's legacy forward into the future. This is what survival looks like. This is what resilience looks like. This is what love looks like when it refuses to be extinguished by evil. The reunion between Holly and her biological family was not a one-time event. It was the beginning of an ongoing relationship. They stay in touch. They visit when they can. They continue to share stories and photographs and memories. They continue to build the family that should have existed all along. Donna Clouse never got to see this reunion. She died without knowing that her granddaughter was alive, that she had survived, that she was healthy and loved and about to discover the truth. But her daughters completed the mission she started. They found Holly. They welcomed her home. They honored their mother's memory by never giving up. Somewhere, somehow, I believe Donna knows. I believe she is at peace now, knowing that her search was not in vain, that her granddaughter was found, that the family is together again. It is not the ending any of them wanted. It is not justice. It is not restitution. It is not the killers behind bars where they belong. But it is something. It is love surviving against impossible odds. It is family finding each other across decades of darkness. It is truth emerging from a grave of lies. And sometimes, that has to be enough. We need to talk about justice. Because this story forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Sometimes, justice does not come. Sometimes, the guilty go unpunished. Sometimes, evil escapes into the grave before accountability can catch up to it. The people who murdered Dean and Tina Clouse were never arrested. Let me say that again, because it needs to be absolutely clear. No one was ever arrested for these murders. No one was ever charged. No one was ever brought to trial. No one was ever convicted. No one ever spent a single second in a jail cell. Every single suspect died before the case was solved. The couple who raised Holly, who were directly connected to the Manson family, both passed away before investigators identified Dean and Tina's remains in 2021. Other members of the group died over the preceding decades, some from natural causes, some from illness, some under circumstances that were never fully explained. By the time forensic genealogy cracked the case wide open, there was no one left to arrest. The killers had all escaped. They had lived out their full natural lives. They had watched television and eaten dinner and celebrated holidays and done all the normal things that free people do. They had never been handcuffed. They had never heard their rights read to them. They had never sat in a courtroom while a prosecutor detailed their crimes. They got away with it. Completely. Totally. Absolutely. This is a failure. There is no way to sugarcoat it or spin it into something palatable. The justice system failed Dean and Tina Clouse. It failed their daughter Holly. It failed Donna Clouse, who died searching for answers that came too late. It failed everyone who believes that murderers should face consequences for their actions. If the case had been solved in 1980, the killers could have been prosecuted. If the bodies had been identified in 1990, the killers might still have been alive to face trial. If anyone had connected the dots in 2000 or 2010, there might have been at least one person left to hold accountable. But the case was not solved until 2021, and by then, it was too late. The window for justice had closed forever. Some people might argue that the killers faced their own form of justice. Maybe they lived with guilt. Maybe they had nightmares about what they did. Maybe the weight of their crimes tormented them in their final years. We cannot know what went on in their minds or what they suffered privately. But that is not justice. That is speculation. That is hoping that karma exists because the legal system failed. That is trying to find comfort in the idea that maybe, somehow, they did not get away with it completely. The truth is simpler and more painful. They did get away with it. They murdered two young parents. They stole a baby. They constructed an elaborate lie that lasted over 40 years. And they were never held accountable for any of it. Holly will never see her parents' killers brought to justice. That wound will never fully heal. She will carry it for the rest of her life, wondering what it would have felt like to sit in a courtroom, to watch the people who destroyed her family face the consequences of their actions, to hear a judge pronounce sentence and know that finally, something was being done. She will never have that. No one will ever have that. The opportunity is gone forever. But the story does not end with this failure. Because even in the absence of legal justice, something important happened. Something that matters. Something that the killers could not prevent no matter how long they lived or how carefully they hid their crimes. The truth came out. For over 40 years, the truth about Dean and Tina Clouse was buried. Their identities were erased. Their murders were hidden. Their daughter was raised on lies. The people who did this believed they had gotten away with it completely. They were wrong. The truth emerged. It was dragged into the light by determined investigators, by advancing technology, by family members who refused to stop searching. The killers may have escaped prison, but they did not escape history. Their names are known. Their crimes are documented. Their connection to the Manson family is established for all time. They are remembered now not as the respectable people they pretended to be, but as murderers and kidnappers. Their reputations are forever stained. Their legacies are forever tarnished. The lies they built are destroyed. This is not enough. Let me be absolutely clear about that. This is not enough. This is not justice. This is not what Dean and Tina deserved. This is not what Holly deserved. But it is something. Truth has power. Truth bears witness. Truth says to the world, this happened. These were the victims. These were the perpetrators. This is what was done. And sometimes, when justice fails, truth is all we have left. We have come to the end of this story. But stories like this do not truly end. They echo forward through time, touching lives and changing hearts in ways we cannot predict. Dean and Tina Clouse were two young people who fell in love, got married, and had a baby girl. They were not famous. They were not powerful. They were not important by any measure the world typically uses. They were just a family, trying to build a life together, dreaming of a future that would never come. They disappeared in 1978. Their bodies were found in 1981, but remained unidentified for 40 years. Their daughter was stolen and raised by the people who murdered them. Their killers were never arrested, never charged, never brought to justice. Every single suspect died before the case was solved. By almost any measure, this is a tragedy without redemption. A horror story with no satisfying ending. A reminder that sometimes evil wins. But that is not the whole truth. Because Dean and Tina's daughter survived. Holly is alive. She knows who she is now. She knows where she comes from. She knows that she was loved, fiercely and completely, by parents who were taken from her before she could remember them. Holly has reclaimed her identity. She has embraced her biological family. She has built relationships with aunts and cousins who searched for her for decades. She has given her own children the gift of knowing their true heritage, their true grandparents, their true history. Dean's sisters finally have answers. They finally know what happened to their brother. They finally got to meet the niece they had dreamed of finding. They finally completed the mission their mother started and could not finish. Donna Clouse did not live to see the resolution, but her daughters honored her memory by never giving up. They carried her torch forward. They finished what she started. And if there is any justice in the universe, Donna knows now. She knows that Holly was found. She knows that the family is reunited. She knows that her love mattered, that her searching mattered, that her refusal to give up mattered. This story has also changed the broader world in small but important ways. It has brought attention to the power of forensic genealogy. It has encouraged other families with cold cases to submit DNA samples and keep hope alive. It has reminded investigators that no case is truly hopeless, that technology continues to advance, that answers can come even after decades of silence. Holly has used her platform to advocate for these causes. She has spoken publicly about the importance of DNA databases, the need for continued cold case investigation, the value of never giving up on missing persons. She has turned her personal tragedy into a force for good, potentially helping other families find the answers they deserve. The killers may have escaped prison. They may have lived their entire lives as free people. They may never have faced a courtroom or heard a verdict or worn an orange jumpsuit. But they did not win. Not completely. They did not erase Dean and Tina Clouse from history. The names they tried to bury are now spoken around the world. The family they tried to destroy is now reunited. The truth they try to hide is now known by everyone who hears this story. Their crime was exposed. Their cruelty was documented. Their connection to evil was established beyond doubt. They will be remembered not as whatever they pretended to be, but as murderers, kidnappers, and cowards who hid behind time and death to escape accountability. That is their legacy. That is what they left behind. That is how they will be remembered for as long as this story is told. And Dean and Tina? They will be remembered differently. They will be remembered as young parents who loved their daughter, as victims who deserved so much better, as people whose memory refused to die no matter how hard others tried to erase it. Holly carries them forward. Her children carry them forward. Everyone who hears this story and refuses to forget carries them forward. Love endures. Truth prevails. Family finds its way home. Dean and Tina Clouse disappeared in 1978. Their killers were never arrested. But their story did not end in that wooded area near Austin, Texas. It continued through their daughter, through their family, through the truth that finally emerged after more than 4 decades. This is not the ending anyone wanted. It is not justice. It is not fair. It is not the triumph of good over evil that we crave in our stories. But it is victory of a kind. Victory in the form of survival. Victory in the form of reunion. Victory in the form of truth that could not be buried forever. Holly Clouse is home now. Not home in a physical place, but home in her identity. Home in her family. Home in the truth of who she is and where she came from. And that has to matter. That has to count for something. That has to be the answer to all the injustice and all the pain and all the decades of searching. Love wins. Not always in the ways we expect. Not always in the ways we deserve. But in the end, love wins. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this story. Thank you for bearing witness to Dean and Tina Clouse, 2 people the world forgot for far too long. Thank you for caring. If this story moved you, share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story. Leave a comment telling me what you think, what you feel, what this story means to you. And remember, every victim has a name. Every cold case has a family waiting for answers. Every truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually find its way to the light. This has been the story of Dean and Tina Clouse. May they rest in peace. May Holly live in peace. And may we all carry their lesson with us. Love endures. Truth prevails. Family finds its way home.